Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to chat about the movie Van Diemen's Land. So I saw this movie last week. It's been out for quite a while, but I only just got around to watching it, and it seems kind of relevant to my channel because it's about convicts and early Australia. And I don't know how many of you have watched it, but I thought I would just kind of talk about my thoughts on the movie and see where we go from there. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell because it really helps out my channel when you do, and it informs you when I upload. Okay, so let's just get into it. I watched this movie last week. It was interesting. It is about the convict Alexander Pearce. Now, I imagine most of you have already heard of Alexander Pearce. At least if you're Australian, you probably have. If you haven't, and if you want to go and watch the movie, I'll give you an advance notice now. There will be spoilers in this. I am going to talk about his story. So if you're worried about spoilers and you want to go and watch the movie for yourself, go ahead and I'll see you later. But for those of you who want to stay, or if you've already seen the movie, or if you already know the story of Alexander Pearce, you'll know what it's about and there won't be any surprises to you. So first thing I'll say is that I don't generally go for like arty kind of movies. Like, it's just not usually my style. So when I watched this actually kind of isn't my style. It falls into what I would consider to be a little bit more arty. That's maybe because there's a lot of like, it's beautiful cinematography. Like the filming is just stunning. The landscapes, the sort of camera work, and there's very little dialogue in it. So it felt a bit arty to me in that way, but I still did enjoy it because I guess it's a story that I was familiar with and I was just interested to see how they sort of played it out. The actors were also really good, so yeah, I'll just get that one out of the way to start with. As far as the story, like I said, most of you are probably familiar with the story of Alexander Pearce, but if you are not, it is a crazy, crazy story. So I'll just go into it a little bit and then kind of compare it with the reality. So I felt like the story stuck fairly well to the truth, at least the story that we have. But essentially, Alexander Pearce was an Irish convict who was transported to Australia for 7 years for stealing shoes. He stole 6 pairs of shoes, which to me actually sounded like quite a lot because a lot of convicts I've come across have done far less to be sent out here. A lot of them have maybe stole like 1 item of clothing. So stealing 6 to me puts him in the category of an actual criminal. So he was presumably stealing 6 pairs to on-sell them or something like that. So he probably was a petty criminal at the time. So he was transported out here for 7 years, and when he was in the colony he reoffended. I think he absconded and then forged an order maybe. In any case, people who reoffended once they were already in Australia got sent to sort of a secondary penal colony, and those places were the absolute worst. So we're looking at places like Norfolk Island, Moreton Bay and Van Diemen's Land. In particular, Pearce was sent to Sarah Island in Macquarie Harbour in Van Diemen's Land, what is now known as Tasmania. So Sarah Island would have been absolutely horrible. It would have been full of just extreme hard work, being beaten and flogged and pretty much like treated like crap like all the time. It would have been an extremely harsh existence. And also keeping in mind that it was such a remote area. So they were at the end of the earth. There was nowhere to run from there, kind of thing. They were surrounded by wilderness that's now considered some of the toughest terrain in the world, that only the most experienced sort of people can manage to navigate, and even then it's extremely tough. So they were surrounded just by this wall of wilderness, and they were undergoing just extreme harsh treatment. So it was no surprise when Pearce and some of his fellow convicts decided to escape. So I've got some notes here because I knew I wasn't going to remember all the names. I'm not that familiar with this story. So on the 20th of September in 1822, Pearce, along with 7 other convicts, escaped. That was Alexander Dalton, Thomas Bodenham, William Kennelly, Matthew Travers, Edward Brown, and Robert Greenhill, and John Mather, or Mather, sorry. So the 8 of them managed to escape while they were working, and it doesn't seem like it was a really extremely well planned out sort of escape. So they only had food for a few days, but one of them, Greenhill, was a sailor and he was known to be sort of a pretty good navigator, and they thought that they would get to a boat, in which case they could sail somewhere else. But he used his navigation skills in the wilderness just to head east. So they're on the west sort of coast and they thought that they would head east. So the movie pretty much agrees with that, the escape, and I mean, they made it pretty dramatic in the movie, but it was probably pretty dramatic in the reality. So I don't know exactly how perfectly the movie showed the escape, but it was sort of mayhem and it would have been scary, and they've just run into the forest. From there, like I said, they didn't have much food with them. So when they got, 15 days into the journey, they were starving. And then there's alternate versions as to exactly what happened. In the film, what they did was they killed Dalton, and Dalton was shown in the film to be Pearce's friend, sort of. So that was sort of very dramatic, and it wasn't Pearce who sort of instigated it, it was the others. And all versions of the story seem to say that Greenhill was kind of the ringleader as far as this cannibalism thing. But yeah, in the film they killed Dalton, they ate him, and they kept going. In reality, it may have been Dalton, or it could have been Bodenham, because the versions seem to change, and oddly, even when I tried to sort of do a little research on this, the versions are conflicting, and I really didn't have time to sort of try to figure out which was the best version. But I think the reason there is conflicting versions is that Alexander Pearce gave differing accounts when he returned, so it was unclear as to which version was the truth. But basically, after they killed and ate the first guy, some of them took fright and ran away. It might have been 2 of them, as was shown in the film, or it may have been 3 of them, including Dalton, if he survived. So in any case, a handful of them turned around and fled. They decided to go back to Sarah Island. They were freaked out. They thought they might be next. So they've tried to go back, and the other 5 of them continued on trying to get to the other side. So cannibalism sounds insane, but they really were in like complete wilderness, and what they would have been used to as wilderness in Ireland or England or wherever they were from was completely different to the Tasmanian bush. So they actually just straight up couldn't find food. They didn't know what to look for. They didn't know probably how to hunt the native animals, or maybe they couldn't even find them because they just didn't know the terrain. Once they'd sort of eaten one person, that it sort of almost set a precedent. It was only a matter of time before the next person got it. So I think that they probably thought that, you know, they'll soon reach civilization again and that they wouldn't need to do that, but the wilderness just went on, and it was such a long and hard journey. The ones that turned back did actually make it back to Sarah Island, but they then died of exhaustion, and they couldn't really give their story or anything. So just the return trip it took their lives. The 5 that went onwards eventually started to get hungry again, and then the next person was killed and eaten. By the end, it was just Alexander Pearce along with Greenhill and Travers that were the last 3 that were trekking through the bush. Pearce assumed that he would be next because Greenhill and Travers were friends, and he just thought he had to be the next that was going to get it. But fate intervened, I suppose, and Travers was bitten by a snake. There are a lot of really poisonous snakes in the Australian bush, so poor Travers was pretty unlucky. But Greenhill insisted on carrying him, and so Pearce and Greenhill carried Travers a good chunk of the way. They like for days, and they would change their route just to make it easier to carry him, so they were in a way wasting time. But Travers ended up getting sicker and sicker, and then he eventually died. and they ate him. And then by the end, it was honestly a cat and mouse game. There was just Greenhill and Pearce left, and they were still trekking on, but they were getting hungrier and hungrier. And just with the two of them, they each knew that if they weren't the one to do the killing, they would be the killed sort of thing. So they were afraid to sleep. They just couldn't trust each other. So they, without any sleep and just wandering around in this wilderness looking for a way out, I cannot imagine what their minds must have been like. It must have been terrifying. And I feel like the Van Diemen's Land film, in a way, sort of portrayed that well, because it did sort of show that sort of inescapable, just, you know, each time they kind of come through some bush, there's just more bush, there's just more mountains, there's like, it's just continuous, and you'd feel like you were just never going to get out of there. In the end, of course, it was Pearce who killed Greenhill, and he managed to then make it out of the wilderness, and he came across some sheep, and it was a person's farm, and it turned out he knew the guy. So he then sort of managed to escape for a little while and committed sort of minor crimes to get by. But eventually he was once again sort of, the law caught up with him, and he was caught. And he told them what had happened. He told them that he had eaten the other escapees, but they didn't believe him because they thought that he was probably just covering for them, that the others had just escaped and he was trying to let them get a head start, I guess. They actually didn't really go into that ending in the Van Diemen's Land movie, which I thought was crazy. So they didn't actually show him escaping. They showed him killing Greenhill, and that was the end kind of thing. And I did do the little sort of text bit at the end that explained what happened, but I feel like him making it to the other end is part of the story. It's like incredible that he even did that. He survived such an insane journey. Anyhow, he was sent back to Sarah Island for the crimes that he'd been committing. Even though they didn't believe his cannibalism story, he was sent back. And once again, he was under sort of torture, and he'd already been through an incredible sort of ordeal. So the combination of the ordeal in the bush and the extra torture that he went through when he went back to Sarah Island, it seems to have just sort of snapped him worse, if that such a thing's possible. His frame of mind, it's just so hard to imagine what it must have been like for him. And I know maybe that sounds like I'm sympathizing with him. In some ways I do, because I can, honestly, until you've walked in someone else's shoes, I don't know. I just feel like it's a crazy story. Anyway, he goes back to Sarah Island, and so he escapes again with another convict called Thomas Cox. The two of them get away, but not too long after, Pearce is caught again, and he has killed Cox, and he has pieces of Cox in his pockets and like on him that he had been eating. So the crazy thing about, well, that actually kind of confirmed the story from previous. The fact that he'd eaten this guy kind of goes, oh, actually maybe he did eat all the other guys too. But the crazy thing about it is he still had food. He had food supplies that him and Cox had escaped with. And it turned out that he was just mad at Cox because when they escaped, it turned out that Cox couldn't swim, and Pearce thought that that was going to slow down the escape, so he killed him and then just butchered him like he did with all the others, probably because he was crazy by this point. So he was sentenced to death, and he was hanged for his crimes. And I mean, there is one image that they've drawn of him after he died, like a sketch artist drew it. But it is just a remarkable story. And alright, so I sort of touched on the movie a little bit during it, but I'll go back and just say, so in Van Diemen's Land, the film, they didn't have too much dialogue. So I found it kind of confusing early on in the movie as to who was even who. Like, they didn't sort of call each other enough sort of names. You didn't get too connected to any of the characters because they just sort of rattled and like prattled between themselves, and I didn't really know who was who. The only name that stuck out to me really was Pearce, because I was familiar with his name because he was famous for what happened. the things that they did get right, obviously, was that it doesn't sound like Pearce was the ringleader, at least not to begin with. It sounds like Greenhill was kind of the ringleader and Pearce went along with it and then just became a part of it, just like they all did. It's kind of a crazy thing for them to do anyway. Like, a lot of people kind of are in situations where they're starving and they don't kill and eat people. So I don't know how the initial kind of thing happened where they did it, like how hungry you would have to be to decide, I can't find any food, I can't hunt for anything, I'm going to instead kill this guy and eat him. And once they've done it once, I guess, you know, it's only a matter of time before they do it again. But for 8 people to escape and for only 1 to survive, I mean, it was pretty remarkable. So I hope that I've done the story justice. I feel like I was rambling a bit, but I just sort of wanted to tell it in my own words. I actually felt like the most gross, gruesome part of the film was the opening scene. And chewing, like that chewing sound and the close-up of the chewing. Oh my god. Like, I get that they were probably sort of, as a film, they were trying to connect this sort of chewing and eating thing with the idea that this guy's going to be a cannibal or that they're all going to become cannibals. But the rest of the film, they actually don't really, like, it's not really that gory. They don't show anyone kind of cooking it up and, oh, I think it shows a few scenes of cooking, but not really eating. They don't show any butchering. Like, it's actually not a very gory movie. The concepts are probably pretty gory and gruesome, but they don't really show too much. But tell you what, that opening scene, the sound of people chewing like that, ugh, ugh, yuck. Anyway, okay, my battery is telling me that it is very low, so I better wrap this video up. I think I've already covered everything anyway. I would love to hear your thoughts on the movie, whether you've seen it, and what you think of the story of Alexander Pearce. It is crazy. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Make sure that you hit the like button and subscribe if you did. And I hope you are having a good one, whatever you're doing. Thank you for hanging out with me today, and I look forward to seeing you soon in my next video. Bye!